There's a certain kind of silence that settles over a place when people are afraid. It's heavy and anxious. It hangs thick in the air and clings to porch swings and telephone poles, to shop windows and gravel roads. In the summer of 1981, in a small Missouri town called Skidmore, that silence was everywhere. People nodded without speaking. They kept their curtains drawn, even during the day. And when a certain pickup truck rolled by, they looked away. No one wrote it down, but everyone knew something was coming. Something had to give. And when it finally did, no one said a word, but it would forever change the small town community. Welcome back to Legends May Live. I'm Drew, and today's story is about a small town that was terrorized for decades, until one act changed everything. But before we get into today's story, just a quick note. While our stories are true, sometimes the years and retellings muddy the waters and skew facts, so just take this as entertainment. For the people of Skidmore, Ken Rex McElroy wasn't just a neighbor. He was the boogeyman. He was a constant, threatening, and unpredictable presence that loomed over the town. Ken was a very large man, and his size and cold stare were usually enough to intimidate his victims into giving him what he wanted. But if that wasn't enough, he was also never far from a weapon. If he wanted something, land, cattle, silence, he took it. And if you crossed him, you had better watch your windows, your tires, your kids, and still, law never seemed to slow him down much. Ken's rap sheet read like a novel. Assault, theft, harassment, intimidation, statutory rape, attempted murder. He was accused of shooting one man over a property line dispute, burning down a barn, and beating others within an inch of their lives. But the charges never stuck. Witnesses retracted their statements, and evidence seemed to always mysteriously disappear. Ken had two things he could always count on to get him out of trouble: a fast-talking lawyer from Kansas City, and a town too terrified to testify. People learned to look away. They would lower their gaze when his pickup passed, and they learned to never answer the door if he pulled up. Because once he had you in his sights, he didn't let go. And his evil knew no bounds. In 1971, he hired 12-year-old Trina McLeod to babysit for him and his wife. And though she and her parents really wanted nothing to do with him, they allowed it because they felt like they didn't have a choice. But soon after, Ken, who was in his mid-30s, began having a physical relationship with Trina. And in 1973, when she was just 14 years old, she became pregnant with his child. And at this point, he had her come to live with him, right in plain sight of his own wife. And of course, all the while, her parents were trying to get her away from him, but Ken responded to their objections by tormenting them. He killed their dog, he burned down their family home, he stalked and just intimidated constantly. When Trina gave birth, though, it was undeniable what had happened, and he was facing the charges of rape, so he quickly divorced his wife and married Trina. And that was because under Missouri law at the time, a spouse couldn't be compelled to testify against their husband in court. And this shielded Ken from the consequences of those allegations against him. But shortly after this, she did try to leave him, which only led to more retaliation against her family. Finally, authorities placed Trina and her newborn into foster care in a nearby town, but Ken was seen parked outside the foster home for hours, sometimes armed, making threatening statements until eventually she went back to him. So for all of this, he faced no consequences. And year after year went by, with Ken's reign of terror continuing. He would just do anything he wanted, and if you didn't like it, you'd just better keep that to yourself. In 1976, a farmer named Romaine Henry noticed that Ken was shooting on some of his farmland, and he drove down to investigate, but before he had a chance to talk to Ken, he immediately turned hostile, and right away, Ken shot Henry in the gut. Then he tried to shoot him in the head, but Henry ducked and the buckshot just grazed his forehead. But Henry was injured pretty bad, but He was still able to speed off before Ken could finish the job, and he did pull through and the police were notified. And while waiting on the trial date to be set, Ken drove his pickup to Henry's farm and just repeatedly intimidated the farmer. When a trial was finally set, he managed to find 2 raccoon hunters who claimed that he was with them when Henry was shot, far away from the property, and so Ken was acquitted. But it was what happened at the town's small grocery store in 1981 that really marked a change. Ernest Bo Bowenkamp was a 70-year-old kindly shopkeeper. He was tidying up his store when he saw this little girl just sneakily putting candy in her bag, and Bo called her out on it, but he was nice about it and kind of just gave her that grandfatherly speech about not stealing and sent her on her way. But that wasn't just any little girl. That was Ken's daughter. And a few days later, Ken pulled up behind the store, casually got out of his truck and walked over and shot Bo in the neck with a shotgun. And amazingly, Bo survived, but just barely. After that, Ken was arrested and finally charged with attempted murder. But the town's relief didn't last very long because, just like always, Ken posted bail. And not being one to learn his lesson, he started stalking Bo's family. Every night, Ken would drive by their house, just creep by slowly with his headlights off, his gun on the dash, and sometimes he would do this multiple times per night, just going back and forth menacingly. The townspeople begged law enforcement to intervene, but they were told that there was nothing more that could be done. So they decided to do it themselves. On July 10th, 1981, just before midday, the town of Skidmore gathered at the American Legion Hall. They had had enough. Ken Rex McElroy, the man who stalked the streets with a rifle, who silenced witnesses, stole children for his own twisted pleasure, the man who gunned down a shopkeeper and then drove by his house like a death sentence, was out on bail again. The meeting was called to discuss one thing. What do we do now? No notes were taken. No one remembers exactly who said what, but one thing is clear. The room was full of fear and resolve. Less than an hour after the meeting ended, word spread that Ken was back in town, and he was parked outside the D&G Tavern with his now adult wife, Trina. He was in his Silverado wearing sunglasses and had his arm hanging out the window, rifle in the back behind him. He reached down to start opening a new pack of cigarettes, and just as he was pulling one out of the pack, he looked up. And when he did, he noticed that people were starting to gather. At first it was just a few, then a dozen, then more, somewhere between 30 and 60 people altogether. They lined the sidewalks and crossed the streets. Some stood with their arms folded, others just watched silently. And Ken's looking around wondering, what's going on? He's having a hard time figuring out what he's seeing because really no one had ever stood up to him before, and now it looks like here's half the town. And then, from the large crowd, someone stepped forward, pulled up their gun, and the first shot was fired. And then another rang out, and another. Between 15 to 46 shots were fired from a .22 caliber rifle and an 8mm Mauser. Ken was hit multiple times, with the fatal blows being once in the head and once in the neck. And as the loud bangs of gunshots began to calm, Ken slumped against the wheel. The windshield was spiderwebbed, the engine kept humming. Trina screamed, but just as quickly as it started, it was all over. In total, between 30 and 60 people witnessed the killing, with some standing only a few feet away. But not a single person claimed to see who fired the first shot, or the second, or any shot. Some said that they were looking the other way. Some say they ducked, some say they froze. Trina told police that she blacked out. No weapons were recovered and no names were named. And when the investigators arrived, they were met with the same story over and over again. I didn't see anything. The FBI and state police were called in, but no charges were ever filed. Rumors spread that there were 2 shooters, and it was agreed on during the Legion meeting. They said that the sheriff knew and left town on purpose to clear way for it to happen, but nothing stuck and no one talked. Justice in Skidmore had arrived, not in the courtroom, but in the street. Not with a verdict, but with bullets. And for the first time in years, the town was quiet and at peace for just a moment. But the killing of Ken Rex McElroy wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a mystery, one that would hang over this town like a low fog, thick, unspoken, and impossible to clear. The media swarmed in. National headlines called it vigilante justice, and yet no one was arrested. No one was even questioned under oath for very long, because no one, not a single person, would admit to seeing the shooter. The townspeople stories were identical. I was there, but I didn't see a thing. And remarkably, after days, then weeks, and then years, that silence never broke. And eventually, Ken's widow, Trina, would file a wrongful death lawsuit against the town of Skidmore, and she did claim that the town conspired to murder her husband, that justice had been replaced with revenge. But the lawsuit dragged on, and years later it was settled quietly for just $17,600. And as strange as it may seem, her remorse at his death, after all that he had done to her and her family, just further shows how he had groomed her from such a young age. But only now, with children of her own to care for, did she receive freedom from him. And along with it, she lost her provider. Hers is the most tragic story of all. She never received the rescue that she truly needed. As for the town people and their silence, maybe they were protecting the shooter, maybe they were all the shooter. But one thing's certain, the day that Ken died, Skidmore changed. Not because the nightmare ended, but because the people made a choice. Justice or peace. Silence or survival. And they've kept that choice ever since. That's it for today's story. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like, follow, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to check out our new website, legendsmaylive.com. Until next time, keep watch and stay safe.